It's so great to see all of you here. I'm Libby Casey with the Washington Post. I'm one of our on-air reporters, and I'm joined by the team that made this story happen. And it's great to have you guys on stage and get to hear from you in person. Lenny Bernstein, health and medicine reporter here at the Washington Post, Scott Higham, investigative reporter at the Washington Post, and Ira Rosen, producer at 60 Minutes, who made this piece happen from the 60 Minutes perspective. So we'll talk about two things in the next little while, where we go from here, but also we want to start with how this collaboration came to be, because the Post and 60 Minutes haven't worked together on something like this in nearly a decade. So let's start with, where does a reporting story start? Lenny, how did you even get the idea? You know, we see the end result 18 months later. Where did this piece start?
So in the beginning of 2016, we had a project launched on the national desk at the Post, and the idea was to try to explain to people why so many people were dying of opioid overdoses, particularly in middle America, particularly middle class whites. And I had an editor who said to me, I want you to explain how all these hundreds of millions of opioid pills get on the street. It doesn't make sense to me why we can't just keep them in the supply chain. And so I started reading up on it, and I started calling around. And indeed, there had been a lot of coverage of the manufacturers and the doctors and the pharmacies, but nothing on these wholesale distributors. So I realized there was an opportunity to write about their role. I started calling around, and eventually someone said, you've got to call Joe Rannazzisi. This is what he's been doing for the past decade. And I did. And pure luck, he had just recently been forced out of his job. He was very upset about what was going on. And he, we started talking. I got an earful, couldn't get him off the phone.
Let me just mention, if you want to join this conversation, you can tweet us, #PostLive. We'll read a comment or two and get our journalist perspective on this. So the distributors are so key here, and I want to just pause for a moment. These are companies I'd never heard of before, but they ended up being a crucial part of your reporting. Just give us a sense of the scope of this.
So the distributors are, the three big distributors are among the top 25 largest companies in America: McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. And nobody's ever heard of them. We had not heard of them. They take the drugs from the manufacturer and they bring them down to the pharmacies and other places where we all buy them. That makes them the most important point in the supply chain if you want to choke off the pills that are getting out onto the street and being used by users and dealers.
Did you know that story at the time? I mean, you get this guy, Joe Rannazzisi, on the phone. Do you go to Scott and say, hey, I might have somebody here? How does this collaboration begin?
Well, I was clueless until, Joe started explaining this to me. And, most reporters have had that conversation where the guy on the other end of the phone says, everybody's corrupt except for me. And then you start checking it out. And actually, everything Joe said checked out. So I took it as far as I could. But very smart editors at the Washington Post realized that it needed an investigative reporter. And so they connected me with Scott.
And where did it go from there, Scott?
Well, we kept hearing these stories that the DEA was slowing down its cases, and a lot of cases that were being made out in the field against these companies were going nowhere, and they were hitting a brick wall in D.C. So we started putting together a list of people who were working in the field, who either were current DEA investigators or who had retired recently, and we just began cold calling them at home, calling their cell phones, sending emails, calling people across the country. And we soon began to connect with people who were very, very upset. These people work for something called a Division of Diversion Control at the DEA, which is, again, something that Lenny and I had never heard of before. I've been a reporter for almost 30 years, and I never even knew that this division existed. And it's a group of really dedicated men and women who do nothing but regulate the pharmaceutical industry and make sure that pharmaceuticals do not spill onto the streets. And so these men and women were deeply frustrated because they were making cases against these companies to try to stop the flow of drugs, and these cases were getting stalled at headquarters. They couldn't understand why, and people in these communities were dying left and right, and they were the ones who were on the front lines. So, moms and dads and grandparents and brothers and sisters were coming to them and saying, what are you guys doing to stop this epidemic? And they were saying, look, we're doing the best we can. So that was the first thing that we did, is we documented this slowdown of cases at the DEA in the face of what we later found out to be intense pressure from Capitol Hill and from the pharmaceutical industry.
How does 60 Minutes get involved?
So we are blessed to be working with these guys. They're fantastic reporters. But I think all of this begins with the fact that people have to trust each other. And I've had a relationship with Jeff Lean, who's a fantastic investigative editor here. We did a story with John Solomon when he was a reporter here on bullet lead technology in FBI lab, and it resulted in a number of people getting freed from jail, the lab changing their analysis of things. So we had a really great experience to build on. And Jeff and I had stayed in touch over the years, and we talked about how, what could we do, what would be the right story to do. And then it ultimately ended up with Marty Barron and Jeff Fager, who's the executive producer of 60 Minutes, having one phone call. And this was the first story that I think Marty or Jeff had brought up in the call. And Fager said, that's what we got to do. I was like, let's hear what else they got. And no, he said, no, this is what we got to do. And so
how did your team know? What was it about the story?
Oh, it was when you have 200,000 people dying in the United States, and still many people are still unaware of the scope of this. That's a big story. And as I joked with my friends here, is you don't have 200,000 people dying without leaving a paper trail. And that's sort of the way I kind of approached it. And what was so wonderful about this collaboration is that each one of us brought a different talent. It's kind of like bringing 3 chefs into a restaurant who each have different skill sets. So we were able to share sources, we were able to share kind of editorial approaches, we stole lines from each other's story. And it was really, and we trusted each other. They looked at our copy, we looked at their copy, provided suggestions both ways, and it was really a true collaboration. I mean, these guys had done a fantastic story in October 2016. Unfortunately, it dropped a couple weeks right before the presidential election, so it was buried. Nobody really noticed it. With the approach to the new bill, it gave it a new impetus to take a second look at the story.
Yeah, it's so different getting somebody to talk to a print reporter than it is getting him to talk to a camera. How did you guys deal with sources, especially Joe Ranazizi, who really stands out in this story? He's someone that CBS has called the biggest whistleblower in nearly 50 years, basically.
Well, we had a lunch in a Greek restaurant in Arlington, Virginia, and we all sat around for a couple hours and we chatted. And I think it's the same with any relationship. A certain level of trust develops. And Bill Whitaker is a guy who's a total gentleman, a total honest guy. He's been in the business forever. He did the interview with Joe, and I think instantly,
and that's, of course,
Bill,
the correspondent on
he's
the
the correspondent on the broadcast, and I think they've developed a great chemistry between Bill and Joe almost instantaneously. We all were in the room and we watched it happen. And the way it kind of unfolded is the interview's going on, and Scott and Lenny are writing down suggested questions as well. I mean, that's what I mean by a true collaboration. They became co-producers during that segment while we were doing that interview, and the other interviews as well.
I asked Lenny if you'd ever worked with 60 Minutes before or done something with 60 Minutes, and you looked at me as though I'd asked you if you were the king of England. I mean, you were like, no, it's 60 Minutes. I mean, did this feel like a unique opportunity for you guys?
I'm a health reporter. I don't get an opportunity to work with 60 Minutes.
He doesn't even go to the doctor. What are you talking about?
I don't get an opportunity to work with Scott all that often until this happened. So it was like a dream come true for me. I also want to say that there's something a little bit magical about when you sit a guy down in front of those 60 Minutes cameras with Bill Whitaker 3 feet away. I mean, we had talked to Joe many, many times, and we had gotten great information from him. Then you read what comes out of his mouth when he's talking to 60 Minutes, and you're like, oh my God. There's just something about it that gets people to talk.
And I think it's a testament to Bill Whitaker's interview style. I don't know how many of you have seen him. I'm sure many of you have. But to see him in action, I mean, basically what he did is he sat down and Ira, helping behind the scenes with this, but sat Joe down and Bill is sitting directly across from him, and their knees are practically touching, and they basically didn't let him get up for almost 4 hours. I mean, maybe a bathroom break, but that was it. They didn't really feed him. They gave him like a little bit of water. And it was like he was at the Bagram Air Force Base, and he was being like interrogated by the CIA. But you're being interviewed by a guy who is like so skilled and is such a gentleman and puts you at ease. And I really learned so much watching Bill interview him, because he took him from the very beginning of his career at the DEA and walked him through this entire episode of him being kind of like the insider of the 21st century. And it was a remarkable thing to see. So it was the narrative arc, and Bill just kind of walked him through his own life.
The key to a good interview, which Bill certainly knows about, is you have to have a conversation with somebody. Like we're having a conversation here. You have to listen to the person's answer, not just try to check off and go through questions. And by doing that, it gets him to go to the next level. And it gets it deeper. And in many ways, it's sort of what television brings to an interview. I'm not saying that newspapers don't, but newspapers sometimes, they get the quote, and thank you very much, we'll see you later. And the TV kind of explores the deeper aspects of things. So it kind of brings it out. So when you have something like, when they were talking about drug dealers in lab coats, that quote that was in the piece, Bill immediately reacted. You know what a horrible thing that is and sounds it. He'd said, I know it because I was there and I arrested those guys and I authorized it. So there was a whole sequence that develops from something like that you get on TV.
Let me remind you, you can join the conversation by using Twitter, #PostLive. An element of this is the accountability question, and talking to members of Congress. You tried to talk with Congressman Tom Marino of Pennsylvania, who of course was nominated to be the drug czar, no longer is. You guys got thrown out of his office, basically. Is this playing out the way I picture it in my head, you showing up with the 60 Minutes film crew, which is like the scariest thing I can imagine coming in through my front door, trying to hold me accountable for something?
I don't know how many of you saw the 60 Minutes broadcast. I'm sure a lot of you did, because it was one of the most viewed broadcasts in recent history. But when we walked in and Bill turned to the poor guy sitting behind the desk there and said, "Hi, we're with 60 Minutes. We'd like to talk to Congressman Marino." The guy looked like he was going to faint. But I've been covering Washington I've been here for 17 years, and I've interviewed lots of members of Congress and lots of people, and a lot of people will hang up on you or they'll slam the door or whatever. But I've never had the police called on me.
Ira, does that happen to you all the time?
That was new.
Only in New York. But no, I mean, it never happened before in Washington. We've done a number of these kind of situational walk-ins, and frankly, most of the time the congressmen come out and try to make the best of it. This was really extraordinary in terms of the reaction.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, we made numerous attempts to set up an interview with the congressman. We contacted his office. We sent over emails. So this was kind of our last ditch thing. It wasn't like we just wanted to ambush him. I mean, but we really felt like he owed an explanation to the public as to why he introduced this legislation, and we felt as a public official that he should be held accountable for this legislation, and he refused to talk about it. So we went to pay him a visit.
Let's talk about what's happened since the 60 Minutes broadcast, since the Washington Post piece aired Sunday. The job here is not to decide what change is affected, right? You guys are telling the story, and the story has legs of its own, and the public decides where to go from here. But we did see President Trump address this, both in a press conference as well as on a radio show. He talked about Tom Marino, and the president said that Tom Marino said, look, if there's even a perception that he has a conflict of interest with insurance companies, if even there's a perception of a conflict, he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Now, this wasn't about insurance companies.
No.
Do you have a sense that the White House, have they responded? Are they savvy to what this story broke and what the feature of this was?
Do I think the White House was?
Yeah.
Yeah, the White House definitely was. And I think they knew that this story was in the works as well. They didn't know quite how the impact would be. I think one of the things about a collaboration is it crosses all the various social platforms. you're covering TV, you're covering news, you're covering all the other various things. And we also share an audience. We have different audiences, the Washington Post and CBS. So the Washington Post audience is being introduced to 60 Minutes and vice versa. And it actually helps bring up everything. And I think, from what I know, President Trump is a regular watcher of 60 Minutes.
Not a regular reader of the Washington Post.
Right. No. And I think that night he was tuned in, from what I understand.
I think one of the things you haven't seen is the hundreds and hundreds, maybe we're into the thousands of emails that we're getting from people. And they basically are two themes, at least the ones that I'm getting. Number one, it's at a time when the press is under so much pressure and under attack from the highest levels of our government. Thanks for doing this. And the other one is, I know someone who died of an opioid overdose. And if I had to break it down into two very broad categories, that's what I'm reading and hearing. And I think those two things, combined with some of the other elements of this story, are what's producing the sense of outrage.
I want to reflect on a comment that was said to you this morning, Lenny, by Dory Berkey, who was here, of course, with her husband, talking about the loss of their son. She said her thought was, it just doesn't happen to us. We're not the family who would have someone die from this epidemic. We didn't expect it to touch us, basically. Are you hearing from people who have that same sense of just this continuing to get worse and continuing to affect people on a very personal level?
Well, at this point in the epidemic, it does happen to people like the Berkeys. There's no more segregating of populations with the opioid epidemic. It crosses party, it crosses ethnicity, it crosses where you live, it crosses all those lines. They're gone now. In 2016, there's going to be about 64,000 people who have died of drug overdoses when the final numbers are in, and more than half of those are going to be opioid overdoses. So while the Berkeys were shocked because they're such a normal, average, working class, middle class family, and didn't expect this to happen to them, it does. It happens to everyone at this point, from the wealthiest folks on down.
Is this going to get worse before it gets better?
I suspect it is. I hope not, but I suspect that the curve has not been bent yet. I fear what's going on right now. I hear it anecdotally, and there's early indications of 2017 being even worse. The one glimmer of hope right now is that doctors have started to reduce the number of prescriptions for these things that they write, so that will keep future substance abusers, that will keep the number of future substance abusers down somewhat, but I do fear that we are going to see larger numbers before we start to see smaller ones.
What else do you sense has happened in the last couple of days since the stories have broken?
Well, now there obviously is a mad dash to get somebody to run the drug czar's office, so we'll see what happens there. But there's also a lot of pressure now being put on this law that Mr. Marino had introduced, and along with a handful of other members of Congress. So we'll see what happens with that. The DEA chief judge has written a 115-page legal analysis of this bill, in which he says this upends 40 years of law, and it really makes it very difficult for the DEA to do its job. And so AG Sessions yesterday, along with the Deputy Attorney General, said that they were looking at this very seriously. I think there's a lot of people at the Justice Department, perhaps at the White House, legal counsel, taking a look at the law and what it says. I mean, if you or I were to read this law, it's a lot of gobbledygook. But if you're a drug lawyer or somebody who's in that world, you know exactly what those words mean and exactly what those words will do. And I think this is one of the reasons why it kind of slipped through Congress, because a lot of people said, well, it's the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act. I mean, why would you be opposed to something like that? Well, it does nothing to ensure patient access. It does nothing to improve enforcement of the nation's drug laws. It actually does the opposite. So I think that's probably the next step, is what happens to that law. There have been calls to repeal it, and we'll have to see what happens.
We just heard in the green room from some of the senators there that the Senate Judiciary Committee will be holding a hearing soon on the bill. And I would not be surprised if Joe Renazizi is their first witness.
You know, I heard from Scott as well that you've gotten so many emails, just an overwhelming flood of emails and a lot of personal accounts. This has happened to my family. Thank you for reporting on this. But also, this story gets at the fundamentals of government, right? A bill, it doesn't hit my schoolhouse rock memory of like how a bill becomes a law, right? Where everybody reads it and talks about it and discusses it and changes it and then votes on it. So are you getting feedback from people who are glad that you're taking the scales from our eyes about how legislation really happens here in Washington?
No, absolutely. We've gotten a lot of readers calling and writing saying, thank you very much. You know, you're holding people accountable. This is exactly what journalists are supposed to do. I've gotten, you know, notes from people saying, I've never written to a reporter in my life. Thank you very much. And, you know, I've been doing this for a while. So it's been a really humbling experience. And I think that what we were able to do is pull the curtain back on how Washington really works. And it's not very pretty. Lobbyists do write legislation. Members of Congress do not pay attention to that legislation. A lot of them take money from special interests without really understanding what is behind that money, or just kind of turning a blind eye to what these corporations really want. But these companies don't give money to members of Congress for nothing. They usually want something in return. And I think what the Washington Post and 60 Minutes has shown the country is that, you know, our elected representatives need to pay a little bit more attention to what's happening in the halls of Congress.
We have a comments section on the 60 Minutes webpage, and normally after a story that I've done, it's 50-50. You know, you guys should be strung up. You totally missed it. You media, you lefties. This is the first time I've actually, in reading the comments, it's almost universal. Good for you guys, and congratulations, and do more of it. I've never had a story in the years I've been there that have been like so positive in the comment section, because as you know, the United States is divided. These comments were not divided.
And I think that goes back to what Libby and Lenny were saying, is that this knows no bounds, this epidemic. And so everybody knows somebody who has been affected. Everybody knows somebody who has died, or they know somebody who knows somebody who has died. And these are Republicans, these are Democrats, these are families that have no political bent whatsoever. This is not a political issue, and I think that's why there's been such an outpouring of appreciation from all kinds of people, because this has nothing to do with politics.
People on Twitter are generally wondering, are enough people covering the epidemic? Are enough news organizations covering the epidemic, especially from an investigative lens? So they're asking, you know, what other angles? Where else can this reporting go? So, of course, we don't expect you guys to divulge exactly what you're working on. What insight can you give us of where this goes?
Well, as everyone knows, regional newspapers have been hit very hard over the past 10, 12 years. And all of them are covering the opioid epidemic, but they don't have the luxury sometimes of our two news organizations to spend 6 months on an investigative piece like that. So, you know, we are grateful for that opportunity. I think that some of them are doing a damn good job reflecting what's going on in their community and making the people who could change things aware of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the Gazette in West Virginia just won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of this epidemic, and that's really inspiring to us, to see these small news organizations that are struggling because they've lost so much advertising over the last decade, still putting resources into this story is really important. So we cheer all those people on.
Ira, where does this go from here?
I think that the story that we did will get local television stations now to say, let's cover it in our area in a bigger way. Let's not just cover, you know, the car crash or the local 3-alarm fire. Let's devote resources to this. And when that happens, here's how it works in Washington. So those stories happen. People at home get outraged. They call their senator and congressman. The senator and congressman looks at the mail and the incoming phone list and says, oh, I better do something about it. And so legislation is then proposed maybe to remedy it. Law enforcement maybe devotes more resources in a proper way. And then ultimately it goes to the executive branch that says, oh, this is going to be a big voting issue in 2020. And so then it happens. So in many ways, it begins with the media coverage. And it's being recognized now in the local level, probably which is the most important level in media at the moment. And once when that happens, it kind of finds its way to Washington.
Should we watch out for more collaborations between the Washington Post and 60 Minutes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about that? The journalist in me is...
We won't be doing the Chicago Cubs.
Okay. No Nats coverage. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing some insights into your reporting. Let me just remind you, we've been talking, of course, with Ira Rosen, producer at 60 Minutes, responsible for the story there, and our reporters here at the Washington Post, Scott Higham and Lenny Bernstein. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us for today. And let me just remind you that you can follow all of our upcoming events at WashingtonPostLive.com. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
Sure. Thank you, Libby. Good job.